Hello everyone! In this video we are going to cover the basics of chess. I really mean the absolute basics, so in this video you'll be learning about how to set up the board, the pieces, about some chess terminology, piece movements, how each piece moves, about the captures and some special moves, checkmate, rules, and in the end we will look at a game and see how that goes. Okay, so let's start with our first topic, how to set up the board. So the board should always be set up such that the rightmost square should be a white square. So if a person is sitting on this side and another person sits on that side, the rightmost square of that person should be a white square. So for the person sitting on this side, this is the rightmost square and it should be a white square. And for the person sitting on that side, this square is the rightmost square and it is a white square. But imagine if a person sits on this side, the rightmost square is no longer the white square. So that's not the right way of laying out the board. So the board should always be set up such that the rightmost square is a white square. Now let's see how to set up the pieces on this board. As you can see, you have several different pieces here. This one is the king, which is the most important piece in chess. If you lose that king, it means you lost that game. And then you have a queen, which is the most powerful piece. And also a couple of other pieces. Knight, this is called a knight, which is like a horse, and it can jump over other pieces. This is a bishop, and you have a rook and pawns. So you have 8 of the pawns, a couple of rooks, a couple of bishop and knight, 1 queen and 1 king. So let's see how to set up these pieces on the board. So first you can set up the rooks. They go in the corners. So you have 2 rooks each, so pick up those 2 rooks and you can place it in the corners. And then beside the rooks comes the knight. So you have a knight here and you have a knight there. So that's their initial position. And then the bishops. You have 1 bishop close to the knights. Then comes the queen. So since this is a white queen, it comes on the white square. So it comes here. And then comes the king in the remaining square. So that's this square. Now you have 8 pawns. They all go in front of these pieces. So white is now set up. Let's do the same thing for black. We have rooks and we place them in the corners. The knights come beside the rooks. Then come the bishops. Then the queen, since this is a black queen, it goes in the black square. And then the king in the remaining square. Then comes the pawns. So this is the way of setting up the board, and once you're set up, you can start playing. White always goes first, so white will move first, and then black continues to play against white. So now that we know how to set up the board, let's just look at some chess terminology, and then we'll move on to piece movements. So let me clear the board again. So these squares, which are white, are called light squares. So all these white squares are the light squares, because in most of the boards sometimes it might not be exact white. It can be cream, it can be ivory, and so on. So these squares are referred to as the light squares. And then you have the darker squares as well, which are obviously called dark squares, because if you see in this board it's slightly brown, but when you look at real boards you can get it in all sorts of colors. There are green dark squares, there are brown dark squares, there are red dark squares, there are blue dark squares, and so on. So these are referred to as dark squares and these are referred to as light squares. And then you have ranks. The horizontal line of squares is called a rank. So this is one rank, and this is another rank, and this is another rank, and so on and so forth. So all these ranks are numbered. This is the first rank, and this is the second rank, and so on. This is called the 8th rank. But when we talk about ranks, it is for both players, and for white, who is sitting on this side, this is the 8th rank. And for black, who is sitting on this side, this is the 8th rank. So those are the ranks. And the vertical line of squares are called files. So you have several files, and they are named alphabetically. You have A file, B file, C file, and so on. And it's the same for black here. So this is the A file, this is the B file, this is the C file, and so on. So those are the files. And last, it's the diagonals. A diagonal is a line of squares which is obviously in a diagonal. So these are the diagonals. So this is a white diagonal, which I'm pointing with the mouse. And you also have darker diagonals. This, for example, is a dark diagonal. So that's all the chess terminology we need to know before learning the piece movements. So let's get forward and learn the piece movements too. First, we look at the king. So if there's a king, he can move to one square that's adjacent to it. So he can move here, he can move here, he can move here, or here, or here, and so on. So it can only move one square that's adjacent to it. It cannot move any other number of squares. So there is one special move which we'll look at later, but for now just remember that this king moves to just one square that's adjacent to it. So that's the king move. Next, let's look at the rook movements. Let me just remove the king here, and let me get the rook. So the rook moves in straight lines. So the rook moves horizontally along straight line or vertically along a straight line. So that's how the rook moves. And none of these pieces here except the knight can jump over other pieces. What is jumping over? I mean, if you have any obstacles in between. So this is an obstacle for the rook. This is another obstacle for the rook. So the rook can just move only until it is allowed to. It cannot jump over obstacles and it cannot go there. So the only possible moves for rook here are it can go to these directions, can go till here, but it cannot cross the pawn. And since this is an opponent pawn, it can capture this pawn if it wants to, because it's of the opposite color and you're playing against your opponent. You can capture his pawn if you want to. If you don't want to, it can go along these line of squares, but it cannot cross the pawn and jump over here. If it wants to capture, it can capture it from this square, but it cannot go here, jumping over that pawn. So that's how a rook moves. And it's true for all of the pieces except the knight, which we'll look at in a minute. So now let's look at the bishop and see how the bishop moves. You've got two bishops, and the two bishops are on opposite colored squares. So one is in light square and the other is in darker square. So the bishops move along diagonals. So what are the diagonals? These are the diagonals. So it can move, the light squared bishop can move along light squared diagonals. So it can go anywhere along these light squares, since this is a light squared bishop. Now this bishop is a dark squared bishop, and it can move along darker diagonals. So it can go along darker diagonals. But a white squared bishop or the light squared bishop cannot go over darker diagonals, and similarly with the dark squared bishop cannot go over light squared diagonals. So you have the bishops, you know how they move. Now it's time to learn how the queen moves. Let me get the queen here. So the queen has the power of both the rook and the bishop. It can move just like the rook, so it can move horizontally along any number of squares. It can also move vertically along any number of squares. So that's how a rook moves, right? So the queen also moves along straight lines horizontally or vertically, and can also move along the diagonals. So it can move along the dark square diagonals because it is in a dark square. So it can move along any of the dark square diagonal right now. So it can move here, it can move here, it can move here. So it moves in a diagonal from this square. But let's say the queen is not here but maybe here. Now it can move over light square diagonals. So it can move along this diagonal, or this diagonal, or this diagonal, or this one. So the queen moves along light square diagonals or dark square diagonals based on which square it is on, and it also moves like the rook, like along the horizontal line of squares and the vertical line of squares, which are the files or the ranks. So that's how a queen moves. Now let's look at how the knight moves. The knight is a special piece, so it can jump over things, which we'll look at in a minute. The knight usually moves in L square. So what is an L square? It moves straight, 2 squares straight, and then 1 square to the right or left. So from this square, this knight can move to this square. Alright, from this square, it can move to this square. Because if you notice, this forms an L. So it can move here. And even this forms an L. So it moves along light squares. So if you look at the knight, from this square, it can move to this square. If you notice, this is an L shape. So it can move here. And this is also an L shape. So this can move here. So it can move to all of these squares, which form an L shape. So this is an L shape. And this is an L shape, this is an L shape, and so on. Now you get the point, right? So it moves in L shapes. Let me just remove all of these things. So I said it can jump over pieces. So what do I mean by that? Let's say there are some things that's obstructing the L shape from the knight, but it doesn't really matter. The knight can still move an L shape because it jumps over pieces. These two things do not bother knight, so it can go here or here, it doesn't really matter, so it can go over there. So what is an obstruction for white? Really, if it's your own piece that's blocking the square it should go to. So if you have your own piece, you cannot go to that because that pawn is obstructing this knight, but you can always go to this square or any other squares. So that's how a knight moves. Now let me show you how the pawn moves. You have the pawns in the second rank, and initially when they're in their birth position, that is in the second rank, they can move 2 squares ahead or even 1 square ahead. So they can move here or they can just move 1 square. So that's how a pawn moves. And once the pawn has moved, it can only move 1 square ahead, so it can only go 1 square ahead. But when it's in its birth position, that is when it's here, it can either move 1 square or it can move 2 squares. It's up to the person who's moving the pawn. So that's how the pawn moves. Now how does a pawn capture? A pawn captures diagonally. So a pawn captures anything that's here. It can capture anything that's there, but it cannot move diagonally. It can only move straight like we have just seen it, but it can capture something that's diagonally in front of it or adjacent to it. And the pawns only move forward. They cannot come backwards. So it cannot capture backwards too. It can only capture forwards. So it can capture forwards like this. So let's say there is something else that's diagonal to this pawn. Now this pawn can capture that pawn like that. So that's how a pawn moves. And the pawn captures diagonally. Whereas any other pieces, they capture if they can go to that square. If they cannot capture it. For example, let's look at the bishop. If there's a bishop here, and if there's a pawn here, now the bishop can actually go to the square if not for the pawn, right? So the bishop can actually capture this pawn like that. So that's possible, but A bishop cannot jump over the square, so if we go back to our previous position, if there's a bishop here and there's a pawn here, it cannot jump over it and go there, just like we noticed with the rook. So that's how all the pieces move and capture. So now let's look at special moves. There are a few special moves in chess, which I'm going to show you now. And one of those is the castling. So this is the initial position of the king, and this is the position of the rook. And you also have another rook on this side. Now if you want to castle, castling is a special move. Usually the white king just moves one square that's adjacent to it, right? So with castling, it can move two squares. And then the rook jumps over the king and comes beside the king. So that is called castling, and it's a special move in chess. You have some rules around it, and we'll discuss that in the end, but this is what castling is. And castling on this side is called short castling. So if you look at it here, there are just two squares in between the king and rook, and the king moves two squares. The rook comes beside the king. So this is called short castling. There is also a long castling with the other rook, and it's called long castling because you have three squares in between the rook and king. So now if you want to do a long castling, the king, as always, when it's castling, moves just two squares, and the rook comes beside the king. So that is long castling. As you can see, I can repeat it. So the king, as usual, moves two squares, just like it does when it moves on this side. So the king moves two squares, and the rook comes beside the king. So that is long castling. And white and black can both do castling. It's just like building a fort around the king to make it safe. So it is always good to castle when you're playing a chess game. So that is one of the special moves. Let's look at other special moves. One more special move is the pawn promotion. So let's say you have a pawn and you pushed it so far that it has reached this square, and then you pushed it to the final square. What happens then? Is this pawn dead because it cannot move anywhere forward and it cannot capture anything that's diagonally in front of it? No, in fact the pawn gets a promotion. It can get promoted to either of these pieces, not the king, but the queen, knight, bishop, or rook. So the person who has pushed the pawn so far, when it's reached the 8th rank, he can replace it with a queen if he wants to, or he can replace it with any of these pieces. So if you push the pawn till here, if you want a rook, you can get the rook and replace it here. So the pawn gets promoted to something bigger. That's what it means. So most of the time people love the queen because it's the most powerful piece and they make it a queen, but there are some positions in which you would want to take another piece, and we'll look at it in more detail in future classes, but this is pawn promotion. So that is pawn promotion. And let's look at what an en-pass is. So that is also with the pawn. And an en-pass is when the pawn crosses half the board. So what is half the board? Let's say this is half the board, right? It's 4 ranks for each player. So this is one half of the board, and this is another half of the board. So if a pawn crosses half the board and it just crosses it, so if the pawn is here, it's in the border of the first half of the board, and it just crosses the board. Doesn't cross too much, it's not here or here, but it just crossed the board and has reached the 5th rank. So this is 5th rank for white. And similarly for black, if black has come here and then pushed the pawn ahead, now it has just crossed half the board. So if a pawn crosses half the board, and if there are pawns that are adjacent to it, so let's say there is another black pawn here and then white pawn here. So if there are pawns adjacent to it, and this pawn has just crossed half the board, and black moves 2 squares forward, what happens then? This pawn, this white pawn, gets a promotion. Sorry, not a promotion, but it has a special power. It can capture sideways like this and remove this pawn. So that's called en-pass. And let me explain it again. So now for the black pawn has crossed half the board, and if white pawn moves 2 squares forward, black pawn can capture the white pawn by placing it here and removing that pawn. So that is called en-pass, and that's a special move too, and it only happens when pawns cross half of the board and the other person pushes 2 squares forward. There are some special rules around it too, and we'll discuss it as we go. So those are the special moves. Now we'll look at a check. What is a check? A check is really when the person is trying to capture the king in the next move. Let's say white king is here and black bishop was actually in this position, but it moved to this square. Now in the next move he's trying to capture the king. So this trying to capture the king in the next move is called a check. That means you attack the king and white has to do something to defend about it. Or if he is not able to defend it, it means he lost the game. So that's a check. Now what can white do to defend it if a position was something like this? White has to move away if possible, so he just prevented black from capturing the king here. So that's one way of escaping from a check. And now that you know what a check is, let me show you a checkmate. Let me clear the board. So let's say white king is here and black king is there and white queen was here. So now if white is to move and white's queen is here, if he moves his queen here, now you notice that this is a check because white is trying to capture the king in one move. Now black can try to move away, but can he? He cannot move here because even if he did, white queen will capture the king. That's not possible. So he cannot move away from there. So let me put back the king. So he cannot move here, and for the similar reason he cannot move here because it's possible to capture it. He cannot move here, he cannot move there, and he cannot even capture the queen because then the white king can capture the black king. So the black king here cannot move anywhere. So it's called a checkmate, and white won the game because there is nothing black can do about losing his king. So that is the checkmate. So now you know all the special moves and the piece movements, setting up the board, and some chess terminology. So let's look at what rules do we have with the special moves. So let's go back to one of the special moves. So we said that this is castling and white can do a castling like this. But there are some rules that you need to follow here. If you're doing castling, you need to touch the king first. So you can move your king first and then you can touch your rook and place it beside the king. That is one rule. Another rule is either of these two pieces should not have been moved before castling. So the king shouldn't have been moved before castling in this move, and neither should the rook have been moved. So both of these have not moved any move. In that case, you can castle. If either of these two pieces moved, you cannot castle. That's an illegal move. It's the same with the other rook. So if you have a rook here but not a rook here, or maybe if you have both rooks, it doesn't matter. If you moved this rook and then came back, but this king and this rook have not moved, then you can only castle on this side. Why? Because you have already moved this rook and you cannot really castle on this side. So that's one rule for castling. And another rule is you cannot castle when there is a check. So let's say the bishop was here and he checked the king like this. Now you cannot castle because there is a check. It's just like saying, hey, I attacked your king and you don't have time to build a fort. So when you have a check, you cannot castle. Another rule is that, let's say black's bishop is here. Now it's controlling the square that the king is about to cross the castle. So if something else is controlling the square when the king is trying to castle, then you cannot castle. That's another rule. So, but if you have a pawn here, then this bishop is not controlling this square because this pawn is obstructing the bishop. So then you can obviously castle because nothing is controlling the square that the king has to cross. So then you cannot castle, or you can castle based on if there is no check or nothing that is controlling the square. So that's castling and the rules around castling. And obviously, if you have something that is controlling this square right here, then you cannot castle because then you would move into a check. So you cannot move here because there is already a check to the king. So those are the rules around castling. Now let's look at the rules around en-passant. So as we said, en-passant is when a pawn has crossed half the board and has reached the 5th rank, and if the opponent's pawn moves 2 squares ahead, then you capture it like this, right? So that's en-passant. And let's say this is the position, but black moved 1 square ahead and you moved something else. Let's say you have a rook here and you moved something else. Now let's say black pushes this pawn forward. Now you cannot capture it because you have got a chance to capture it once and you didn't take it, so the next time you cannot capture it. So now you cannot do the capture. But let's say if the pawn, the black pawn, so if the black pawn moves 2 squares forward, then you can definitely capture it, just like the pawn with the en-passant. So those are the rules around en-passant. You cannot capture the pawn if the pawn has moved 1 square forward and then moved the next square. And you cannot capture if you did not capture when you get a chance. So let's say this is a position and black moved 2 squares forward. Now the rook moved something else. Now in your next move you cannot capture this pawn like this because you had the chance once before and you didn't take it, so you cannot take it again. So that's the en-passant and the rules around en-passant. So now that you know all piece movements and the rules in chess, let's look at a game quickly. So I have a game between Leonidov Vladimir and Maximov Vladimir. Leonidov is playing white and he moved his pawn 2 squares ahead, and black did the same thing with another pawn. Then white moved another pawn 1 square ahead. Black moved the knight in L shapes, if you remember. So black got his knight here. White moved his pawn again 2 squares ahead. Black captured the pawn. The pawn's captured diagonally. So black captured the pawn and white captured the pawn again. So if you see, white gave up 1 pawn for 1 pawn of black, so that's an equal trade. Black moved his pawn 1 square ahead. White developed his knight, got his knight out. Then black played the pawn. White played the pawn again, so when white played the pawn, he is now attacking this knight. He's trying to capture this knight in the next move. But black captured the pawn again, and white captured this pawn again. Now again he's trying to capture this knight. Now black got his bishop out in the diagonal and put a check here. So he played this move and the king is under check. So as we discussed before, one way of moving away from a check is moving the king, but as always, if you move the king you cannot castle. So white put something in between the check, so now black cannot capture the king because this is an obstruction too. But black put a check again with his queen, and white did the same thing with his other bishop. He obstructed the check. So black captured this bishop, white captured it back. So since white is always threatening to capture this, black now moves away his knight. Now white castles, so he moves his king 2 squares, and the rook, he places it beside the king. Then black moved his pawn, white moved his rook, then black moved his king. Now white captured the knight, and black captured it back. Now white moved his pawn forward. Now he's trying to capture the queen in the next move. So black moved his queen away from that square. Now white queen moved in a diagonal. And next move he's trying to push this pawn, and when he pushes that pawn he will check the king. So now black prevented it by obstructing the pawn and moving his queen backwards. Now the bishop moved in a diagonal and attacked the queen again, but black captured the bishop. So if white wants, he can capture the queen back, but he made an excellent move. He played pawn forward, putting a check to the king. Now black can capture the queen too, so black captured the queen, and white pushed his pawn. Now you can take either of these pieces. This is pawn promotion. So he picked the queen. Now that's a check. So white is trying to capture the king in the next move. It's a check, but the king can't move anywhere. It cannot move here, it cannot move here, because the queen controls both these squares, and there is nothing that can come in between the king to prevent the check. So it is a checkmate, and white won the game. So I hope you enjoyed the video today, and we'll see you in future videos. Bye bye.